And in English, the word Genesis means origin or beginning. And Genesis is divided into 10 parallel sections called Toledotes in Hebrew, which was translated into Genesis in Greek, which is an account or a genealogy in English. And Toledotes are actually a person's results, which is why most of the sections of Genesis give the account of the children of the person it's named after. And Genesis, in these sections, often narrows down to 2 lines, offering us a choice about which of the 2 lines we want to be a part of. And so last week we looked at the results of the heaven and earth, which were Adam and his sons. Adam's story comes under the account of the results of the heaven and the earth. And Adam's story ends with Seth's line calling on the name of the Lord, in contrast to Cain's line that's exiled from God's presence, but is otherwise materially prospering. And then we came to the results of Adam, which is the generations of death until Noah. There's no stories in the generations of Adam, it's just a list of people who died. Then we get to the results of Noah, which is where we find the record of the flood and the restart of the creation. And Noah's story ends with a blessing on Shem and a curse on Ham's son Canaan. Again, 2 lines. Which one do you want to be a part of? Then we get the results of Noah's sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, which are the nations. And then the results specifically of Shem, which is the family line leading to Terah. And the Shemites or Semites are still called that today. And then the results of Terah are Abraham and his sons. And where we ended last week, Abraham's story ends with a division between Isaac's blessed family line and Ishmael's excluded family line, which is nonetheless materially prospering. God's caring for people from all nations, even if they aren't specifically within the blessing. So then, today we're going to look at the results of Abraham's sons Isaac and Ishmael, who are their sons. Which are their sons. The results of Ishmael are his sons. The results of Isaac are his sons. Again, this is the account of Isaac, and then you hear the story of Jacob and Esau. And then we're going to look at the results of Isaac's sons, Esau and Jacob, which are their sons. Joseph's story is found in the results of Jacob. It's confusing when you read Genesis. You go, wait, what account are we in? I thought you were going to tell us the story of Jacob. Yep, I'm telling you the story of Jacob. Here's his 12 sons and what happened with them. Okay? So Jacob's story ends with an interesting contrast. We've been dividing into these 2 lines. Instead, we really have 2 blessed family lines that are focused on from Jacob, Judah and Joseph. And both of them are almost treated as though they were firstborns. And the nation of Israel would eventually divide into 2 pieces, with Judah in the south and Israel in the north, and that Israel section is often called Ephraim or Joseph. It's like the whole story is down to Judah and Joseph. And in fact, the 2 spies, remember Moses sent 12 spies into Canaan. 2 spies trusted God, Joshua and Caleb. Joshua was from the tribe of Joseph, from Ephraim, and Caleb was from Judah. It's like the whole story has been reduced to just these 2 tribes, even though the other tribes are there, they're included with one of these 2 tribes. Again, we're being offered this choice. Which group do you want to be a part of? But the weird part is this time we've got 2 apparently good options to be a part of at the end. And Genesis is inviting us to be a part of God's people who trust in God's promises. And we know that in Jesus, the promise of God's blessing is available to those who trust God's promises, regardless of what family line you come from, and even if you're not from this nation. God's blessing goes out from Israel to all nations. There's a chart there you can look at for some of the interesting ways to be able to remember these Toledotes, and you can look at that on your own. We're going to skip directly to Genesis 25, which says, "This is the account of Abraham's son Ishmael. and then gives us the genealogy there. And then this is the account of Abraham's son Isaac, and gives us the story of Isaac, which actually contains most of Jacob and Esau's stories. Now, Isaac was born miraculously when Abraham was 100, and his wife was right there, up there in years with him. And then Isaac was 60 when Jacob and Esau were born, and then he lived to the age of 175, and then he died. And if you do the math, that means he was still alive while Joseph was in Egypt. He lived a long time. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob are the three most famous descendants of Terah in Genesis 3. So Isaac is one of these. And then it branches again into two lines, Jacob versus Esau, with only one line trusting in God's promise. And Genesis is the story of creation, and Isaac is the only patriarch to live in the promised land, like Eden, for his whole life. God is creating a new promised land and inviting his people in, and the rest of the patriarchs either started out of it or ended out of it. Isaac is the only one of them to live there his whole life. And there are husband and wife issues all over in Genesis. And Isaac's wife, Rebekah, looks like a new Abraham who's giving up her gods back east to move to this promised land in faith without seeing what God is giving her first. In the story of Isaac, Rebekah is the woman of faith. And then we see that this covenant God started earlier, God gave Isaac the same blessing that he promised to Abraham in the previous generation. And he said those who bless Isaac will be blessed, and those who curse Isaac will be cursed. The same sign of circumcision is repeated, and God uses the stars in the heaven, the dust on the earth, and the sand on the seashore as evidence that he's going to give Isaac a family. Do you remember, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth and the seas, and then God uses the stars in the heavens, the dust on the earth, and the sand on the seashore. That's how many children you're going to have. He's tying his promise to Isaac to his creation. And then God appeared and spoke to Isaac at the start and end of his life to reassure Isaac that Isaac would be the one who would receive God's blessing promised to Abraham. And Isaac is the only one of the three patriarchs that did not get a new name from God later in life. Do you know why? God gave him his name to begin with before he was even born. And it's interesting, his name is a gift from God, but it's also a reminder of a struggle with faith that his parents had. Isaac means laughter, because both Abraham and Sarah laughed when they first heard that they were going to have a baby in their old age. And so his name is both a gift from God and a reminder of this choice of whether we're going to trust God's promise or not. And then Abraham's descendants through Isaac are those who are going to be blessed. And God's place is still the land of promise of Canaan, where Isaac lived his whole life. And really, the only rule that God ever gave to Isaac was stay in the land and trust me to give you a family and a blessing there. The rules were pretty simple. And the blessing is going to be a nation, which includes a land and family, and blessings for his whole family and for the whole world through them. And it's interesting that Isaac made a covenant with Abimelech, the Philistine leader, in order to let him in on God's blessing when he asked. Abimelech came to Isaac and said, God's really blessing you, let's make a covenant. And they had an official inclusion into God's blessings, essentially. Abimelech shows up and says, I want what you've got, and I know your God is giving it to you. Can I get in on this? And Isaac says, sure. That's encouraging for us, not being from Isaac's family, that God is willing to share his blessing with all nations. It was always part of the plan. And then Isaac passed God's blessings on to his son before he died, showing that he was trusting God to keep his promises in the future, even after he died. But Isaac also passed on a curse to his son Esau, who did not value God's blessing until it was too late and he'd already missed out on it. There is grace and forgiveness in this story. God graciously kept Isaac in the land of Canaan his whole life, and he mostly kept Isaac out of repeating most of Abraham's sins. I keep using mostly here because there are examples here. Isaac mostly appears as a secondary character in either Abraham's story or Jacob's story. You think about that, right? Isaac is the son Abraham had, and he's the father to Jacob and Esau. Tell me the rest of Isaac's story. He doesn't get much of a storyline on his own. Do you ever feel like you're that kind of a character in the story? You're just here as part of someone else's story? Isaac is a man of faith and an example to us, even if we're living the kind of life that makes us wonder, am I just going to be a footnote in someone else's story? We're encouraged that this is the kind of people God saves and works with and blesses. And Isaac is a pretty good example of a pretty ordinary guy who trusts God to bless him. What he had that was extraordinary was a blessing from God. Now, there was still some examples of lack of trust in Isaac's story. Isaac still struggled to trust God, and he lied by saying that Rebekah was his sister in order to save himself when he moved into Philistine territory, just like his father Abraham had done. The only differences were Rebekah was not his sister at all. Abraham was trying to stretch the truth here. Rebekah was not. And the Philistines caught him and said, "What are you doing? Why are you lying to us?" The Philistines look like the good guys in this part of the story. It's really interesting. Okay? Isaac also struggled by having a favorite son because of the food that his son hunted for him, and he didn't want to give Jacob the blessing, even though God had promised to give Jacob this blessing before he was even born. He trusts God. He's got the blessing. But do you see what's tempting him away from the blessing? Do you remember what tempted Adam and Eve? It was the food. Do you remember how Noah fell again after the flood? It was from the fruit. And now, Esau is Isaac's favorite because of the food. There's almost this new, fall story going on where Jacob is tempted away by Esau's food. But then Jacob flips it. Jacob lies and says he's Esau and ends up with the blessing. It's a really interesting story. Trust is displayed here. Isaac displayed Abraham's faith that God would give him children, the land, and the blessings. And even when he left the land for a famine, he only went to the Philistine territory. He didn't run away to Egypt. He never left the promised land, even when things got hard. And then, notably, when Rebekah couldn't have children for 20 years, Isaac did not resort to getting another wife like all the other patriarchs did. Instead, it says that he prayed for her, and the whole story is summed up in one verse. How would you like this? How's this for a summary of trusting God? Yeah, she just couldn't have a baby for 20 whole years, and so her husband prayed about it, and God gave them one. That's a long time to pray for something. And to just summarize it like it's no big deal shows that Isaac had faith. Isaac was also willing to move to give Abimelech the land and the wells when there wasn't enough room for them. He was willing to give up even the land that God had given him, similar to how Abraham was willing to give the best part of the land to Lot. He's not trying to hold on to the things God has given him with his own power most of the time. It's a pretty good example of that. And Isaac built an altar and called on the name of the Lord when he lived in Philistine territory to publicly show that all good things came from God. He stood up and planted his flag and said, "All of this is from God," which can be a risky thing to do when you're surrounded by people who don't believe in your God. We're called to follow Isaac's example of trusting God to keep his promises to bless him, which are ultimately fulfilled in Jesus, even if we only ever live an ordinary life like Isaac did. The power of our faith comes from the extraordinary God who keeps his promises, not from how extraordinary we are. In Jesus, God's promise applies to you regardless of what nation you're from, even if you live a relatively ordinary life. That's an encouragement from Isaac. Which brings us to, this is the account of Esau, where we get his genealogy, and then this is the account of Jacob, which tells the story of Jacob's children. Now remember, Jacob was born when Isaac was 60, and he was about 75 or 90, 75 through 90 when most of his sons were born, and then was about 100 years old when Benjamin was born, and he lived to the age of 147 and died in Egypt after meeting most of his grandchildren. It's interesting, their household is 70 members that arrived to Egypt as a new nation. That's how many nations there were after the Tower of Babel. Now we're reminded again that they are a nation by the number 70. And Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob are the three most famous descendants in these three generations, so this story is named after Jacob again. But Judah and Joseph are the two lines that this narrows down to, and by the end of their stories, both of them are trusting in God's promise. God created the new nation of Israel out of Jacob. And Jacob had 4 wives, exhibiting the worst of the polygamy of his grandfather Abraham. And because of the different wives and the different children, he also had the worst of the favoritism of his father Isaac. Now, in his defense, he was tricked into marrying one of those 4 wives, so one of those was not his fault. That's not much of an excuse for him, is it? If God can bring Jesus to the world through this family, he can use any family. This is not just a normal family. This is a particularly messed up family, and God is bringing Jesus through this family. God told Rebekah that he was giving Jacob the blessing that he promised to Abraham and Isaac before Jacob was even born, but Jacob spent almost his whole life trying to earn the blessing that he already had. That's similar to Adam and Eve. The devil showed up and said, if you eat this fruit, you'll be like God. Do you remember what Adam and Eve were literally created as? In God's image. Here, if you disobey God, you can be the thing you already are. It'd be like someone coming over to you and saying, this is a pretty nice house you got here. I'll give it to you if you ... Jacob spent most of his life trying to earn the blessing that he already had. Again, God used circumcision, stars in heaven, dust on the earth, and on the seashore as signs of the promise that he made to him. And God appeared to Jacob in dreams and visions when he left the land of Canaan to go east. God appeared to Jacob again while he was back east, and when God called him to return to Canaan in order to reassure him in all 3 places that God really was giving him the blessing promised to Abraham. And God also appeared to Jacob in human form and wrestled with him when he returned to Canaan. That's an interesting story. God appeared to Jacob in a dream and a vision when he was leaving for Egypt to reassure him that God would bring him and his family back to Canaan after his death. Jesus is God made visible, who appeared to Jacob in human form and wrestled with him. The New Testament specifically says that some of the times that Abraham interacted with Jesus interacted with God in human form, it was Jesus. This looks like it was also Jesus. And Jesus is the ladder between the heaven and earth that God came up and down on, like Jacob saw. And God gave dreams to some of Jacob's children, including Joseph. In fact, God gave 6 dreams to Joseph and to 3 other people in Egypt. But God did not speak to Joseph or any of the rest of them verbally and physically like he did with Jacob. God kept showing up physically to talk to Jacob and even wrestled with him. God did give Joseph, his son, the ability to interpret these dreams, and God sent his Spirit to assist Joseph. God, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit are seen in veiled ways in this story. Now, God's people are the nation of Israel, Abraham and Isaac's descendants via Jacob. Those God is blessing. God's place is still the promised land of Canaan, which Jacob was twice exiled from to the east, like Adam and Eve. Abraham got kicked out to the east. And when Jacob left Canaan and when he returned, there were angels at the eastern border, like the cherubim guarding the Garden of Eden. I think that Genesis is really trying to get us to think of the promised land as the new Garden of Eden. Like, you got to go through the angels that are guarding the entrance on your way out and your way back in. God is saying, I'm inviting you back in. And the rules that God gave to Abraham were to trust God to give you the land, even though you're exiled from it, like Jacob was twice in his life. Once was to the east, the other time was actually into Egypt at the end of his life. There's a blessing here. It's that God will make Jacob into a nation, which is a land and a family, and then bless his family and the whole world through them. God made a covenant with Jacob, and then Jacob made a covenant with Laban to let him in on God's blessing when he asked too. His father-in-law, like Abimelech had done, came and said, I want to make a covenant with you. And Abraham shared God's blessing with him. Joseph's work also blessed and saved not only Israel, but all of Egypt and the surrounding nations. When he went to Egypt, God's blessing is going out to the world through this family. And Jacob blessed his sons before he died, like Isaac had blessed his sons, to show them that they needed to have faith in God's promise for the future. And Jacob and Joseph, who both died in Egypt, both gave instructions to take their bodies back to the promised land after they died, showing that they were trusting God to keep his promise for the future, even after they died. Jacob had his bones taken back immediately, and Joseph had his bones taken back to be buried when they all went back hundreds of years later. And Jesus is the coming ruler in the line of Judah, which Jacob foretold that all nations would obey. This blessing is seen through them going out to the whole world. But there's also Jacob stole the blessing from Esau, who was cursed instead. And Jacob cursed his oldest 3 sons for their sexual sins and their violence in response to other people's similar sins to his. We talked about this last week. The story of Genesis is messy. It is messed up. You don't even want to give you a full list of all the ways that there are sins in Genesis. And Jacob's family participated in that. And Joseph is an interesting counterexample. During the middle of Joseph's story, where he is refusing Potiphar's wife, who's throwing herself at him, Judah is being tricked into sleeping with his daughter-in-law because he won't give his son to the next son in marriage. Like, it's a messy story. And the interesting part is Joseph avoids all of that sin, but Judah, when he's caught, says, kill my daughter-in-law. She's pregnant when she's not married. Just kill her. And you're like, dude, what have you been doing in this whole story? But that's where Judah turns. And from that moment forward, Judah repents and says, she's more innocent than I am. And from that moment on, Judah becomes a good guy for the rest of the story. He's the one who offers himself to Joseph to essentially die, stay in prison, to let his other brother go free. And we're left at the end of the story with 2 pictures of Jesus. Joseph, who was sold into slavery and did what was right and was punished for it, and Judah, who did what was wrong but eventually repented and became a voluntary sacrifice to try to save his other brothers. It's obvious that Jacob and his family's righteousness was not their own. And God showed amazing grace by giving the blessing to Jacob, whose name means the deceiver, and turning him into Israel, which means the God wrestler. He's the one who wrestled God to try to get his blessing from him. And Joseph is a picture of Jesus betrayed for us, who God turned sin into salvation for the world through him. And Jacob is a picture of God the Father, who wants his beloved children back at any cost. And Joseph becomes a picture of God the Father, who welcomes prodigal brothers home and forgives them when they don't deserve it. Now, there's examples of trust and lack of trust in this story too. Jacob worked hard to get the blessing on his own by tricking everyone around him. He tricked Isaac. Well, he was the one tricked by Laban. And even though God had promised Jacob the blessing, he tricked the blessing away from his brother. And again, the use of food through these stories connects it back to the Garden of Eden with the forbidden fruit. And Jacob's sons' judgments of the Canaanite city of Shechem for their sexual sin, while they were guilty of similar sins, is an example of self-righteousness in this story. Isn't this weird? Some of the people who are doing some of the worst things will also, pretend that they're really righteous, upright people while they're doing it. Sometimes we think of these two things as separate things. You've got the proud Pharisees, and you've got the sinners who need to be forgiven. And sometimes the proud Pharisees are secretly doing all of the same things that the tax collectors are doing. And that's visible right here in Genesis, right within Jacob's family. This idea is there. And Judah's confession of his guilt and change over the rest of the story is amazing. And Judah becomes the picture of Jesus offering to lay down his life to save his brother, Benjamin. Now, the examples of trust here. Jacob trusted God by leaving Esau in charge of the promised land when he moved back east. He wasn't trying to hold on to the land himself. Jacob trusted God to save him from Esau when he returned to the promised land. Jacob trusted God by building altars and pillars in all the places where Abraham and Isaac had to publicly claim he was going to trust God. Jacob trusted God by leaving Canaan to move to Egypt before he died, trusting that God would keep his promise to bring both he and his family back there in the future. And Joseph worked hard, doing right throughout the years of hardship, showing that he trusted God to bless him in the future. And the whole book of Genesis ends with Joseph's willingness to forgive his brothers, which shows that he is trusting God to right all wrongs. You notice what we prayed in the Lord's Prayer? Forgive us our debts as we have forgiven our debtors. And Joseph knows he is the recipient of God's blessing and is willing to forgive others because he knows he is only getting this blessing because it is a gift from God. And even in hard times, we're called to trust God's promise to rescue us in Jesus, not taking revenge or trying to get God's blessing for ourselves by sinful means. God is in control and can be trusted to keep his promises to us in Jesus, even when we can't see how that's possible. God can forgive us and even right wrongs that look as final as Joseph's death. It looks like Joseph was dead in this story, and God still made things right. Don't give up. Don't give up hope. We trust in a God who is able to even raise the dead. In Jesus, God's promises apply to you, regardless of what nation you're from, and regardless of what hard times you've been through, and regardless of where you will eventually end and die. Jacob died outside of God's promised land. Joseph died outside of God's promised land. And from a worldly perspective, it looked like they had nothing to show for it. And in Jesus, you have all of God's blessings, even if you die alone outside of God's land with apparently nothing to show for it. Trust Jesus. That promise is yours and will still be fulfilled to you. Okay? Genesis is the beginning of the story of God and his people, which invites us to look ahead. Genesis ends on a cliffhanger with God's people outside of Israel, in Egypt, outside of God's land, looking forward to the fulfillment of God's promise in the future. But it concludes with that God is in control and can be trusted to keep his promises. And we're invited to join God's people in trusting God's promise, which is fulfilled in Jesus. That's what Genesis is doing. It's inviting us to trust this God. And Moses, who wrote Genesis, gave Genesis to Joshua the day that he preached his final sermons in Deuteronomy. And Moses also walked up the mountain to die. And the Israelites were standing outside of Israel on the east side of the Jordan River, ready to cross back into the promised land of Canaan, which is the new Eden, where they are being invited to live in God's presence. And Moses challenged them to trust and obey God when they get back into the land, like God's people in Genesis were called to do, in order to live in a covenant relationship with God. The only problem is that Moses knows that Israel will fail and get kicked out of the land again, just like Adam and Eve did when they lived in God's land. And Moses warned the Israelites that their hearts were the problem. God had given them circumcision, but their hearts were not circumcised. They had the sign of the covenant on the outside, but not on the inside. And so they were going to mess it up, and they're going to get exiled out of God's presence like Adam and Eve did. And Moses says that God's going to bring them back in again after the exile. He looks forward to a new covenant that's coming after the exile, where God is going to circumcise their hearts for real and bring them back into the land from the east. And the Old Testament prophets expand on this post-exile promise by God saying that he's going to give us new circumcised hearts by his Spirit in this new covenant. This promise given to Israel is extended to all nations. And Hebrews says that this new covenant that they were looking forward to has come in Jesus, which is what Jesus said on the night when he was betrayed. He said, "This is my body, and this is my blood of the new covenant, which is poured out for the forgiveness of your sins." Poured out for the forgiveness of all these sins in Genesis. Jesus died as a sacrifice to take away our sins and to inaugurate the new covenant, which he proclaimed at a covenant meal, like we saw throughout Genesis, with the visible sign of bread and wine to eat and drink. I wish we were having communion right now. So leading up to this, this is how Genesis ends, with God saying, "I am giving my son." Jesus is the one who came and said, "I am the one who's here for you. You can be in a covenant with me regardless of what nation you're from." And by faith, we eat and we drink Jesus. We get in on this covenant. Don't trust your own ability to get or keep God's blessings on your own, or you're going to get kicked out. Trust Jesus instead. You won't be successful in earning God's blessing any more than the patriarchs were. You can only accept God's blessing as a gift in Jesus, looking forward to all the blessings God has given us even after we die. That's what they were looking forward to. Jesus died to take your sin away, and Jesus' righteousness counts in your place. God has forgiven all your sin and given you new hearts by his Holy Spirit to all those who have faith in Jesus. This is the fulfillment of God's covenant promises that the patriarchs were looking forward to. And in Jesus, God's promise applies to you regardless of what nation you're from, and regardless of whether you're an ordinary guy like Isaac, or regardless of whether you're from a sinful, messed up family like the Israelites were. No matter who you are, God's promise in Jesus applies to you. Moses was giving this message of Genesis to the Israelites standing on the east, inviting them to come in. And God is giving us this message of Genesis likewise, with the invitation to choose to join Abraham, Isaac, Israel, Judah, and Joseph in trusting in God's promise, and that it applies to you, this promise that's fulfilled in Jesus. Genesis is ending saying, will you trust that God has a plan for all of this terrible stuff that other people have bad intentions for? Will you trust that God is working it towards you putting your faith in Jesus? Come with me. We're going to go live in God's presence. That's the story of Genesis. That's how it ends. The original audience reading it on the east of the Jordan, being invited to follow the patriarchs back in to God's presence, where we are invited to come through Jesus.